Welcome, everyone, this is your friend, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of, what if Spider-Man became Hades, god of death? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic, first-person point of view. Pain, all I could feel was pain. My entire left side was crushed from the drunk semi-driver. I could feel the blood filling up my lungs. I could not move. I groaned as loud as I could as I tried to move, but the warped metal held me like a vice, pinning me to the wreckage. I could feel death's breath on breathing into my soul. I could feel myself dying, and I was not fighting. The pain was too much as I allowed myself to black out and let the soothing touch of death numb the pain. I felt myself relax. I opened my eyes and saw a beautiful woman. She carefully caressed my left side of the cheek before she nodded to herself. She said something in another language that I did not know or understand, and I was met with a male. I could see and feel his power. I felt compelled to kneel before them. The man chuckled and said, "There is no need to bow to anyone just yet, youngster." I stayed down for a few moments before standing up. I asked, "Who are you?" I glanced at the woman and nodded in her direction. "And you?" The man said, "I am Cameo." I muttered and said, "And that is why you look like Stan Lee." I paused and looked at the female. I said softly, "And she must be dead." I sighed and asked softly, "I am dead, aren't I?" Cameo nodded his head and said, "Yes and no. You're dying with about 5% of survival, and with being a cripple if you even survive. But I have another option I think you would like." He paused like a salesman seeing if I took the bait. Like a fool I asked, "What is the option?" Cameo smiled and said, "You will get reborn as a character in the Marvel multiverse." I grinned and said, "Spider-Man." Cameo shook his head and said, "Been taken." I paused and asked, "Iron Man?" "Nope," Cameo replied to me. I smiled and asked, "Captain America?" Cameo said, "No, I will give you a hint, villain." I frowned in thought before asking, "Thanos?" He shook his head and said, "No, close but no." I paused again thinking of some villain, Loki? I asked hopefully. Cameo shook his head yet again and said, "Closer but no, Banana Kid." I sighed and said, "I am not sure, sir." The woman nodded to him and said, "Let him find out." She smirked a little before she faded into the shadows. I looked at Cameo before he said, "Lights out, kid." The next thing I knew I was floating in warm darkness. Line break, first-person point of view. I woke up stuck tight in a type of blanket. I wiggled trying to escape it. It felt worse than a straitjacket. I felt my eyes burning out of frustration. But I realized I was beginning to cry. I thought to myself, what the hell is going on with me? But shortly after that a woman came into the room from behind me. I heard the door open and a sweet perfume fill the room, but I was still unable to move. I began to wail like an infant, unable to control myself at all as I allowed instinct to control me. The woman picked me up and cradled me. I felt safe in her arms as she sung to me softly. I closed my eyes, relaxing to her voice, feeling safe. She kissed me on my forehead and said, "My sweet prince." A few moments later a regal person came into the room. He looked at me and I had to flinch. He wore a golden eye patch. He boomed, "My son Hades." His loud voice made my ears ring as I began to cry again. The woman hissed, "Odin." I fainted when I heard that. I knew then when and where I was. I was likely on Asgard, and I was Hades, son of Odin and the son of Freya. Based on the name, I am going to guess that is the male version of Hela, though Hades is Greek. The next time I woke up it seemed as though years had passed as I wore a long shirt and a type of diaper. I began to walk around the room I assumed was mine. I was left alone in there. I had a feeling this was not the first time this had happened. Memories of the time that has passed came to me as I began to remember who my parents were and how they were. Odin was very busy and Freya took care of me. I was a mama's boy. I looked around the room and I saw a mirror. I looked like I was about 3, maybe 4 years old. I nodded to myself, accepting there was no way around this, but I began to notice a few things about me already. One thing was that my hair was midnight black. The second thing was my skin was a corpse-like pale. The third thing I noticed was that my eyes were an icy blue, cold and distant. I shook my head and pulled my longish hair. About a minute later Freya came in with a bright smile. "It is lunchtime, my little prince." I smiled a little, feeling love for her as I said, "Thank you, mother." She beamed at me as she scooped me up in her arms and blew raspberries on my neck and chest, making me giggle and squeal like a child. Freya chuckled softly as she carried me to the kitchen for some food. I smiled as I cuddled into her, feeling safe in her arms. Time seemed to fly by overnight. I looked to be about 5 years old when I was able to speak more clearly. I had asked Odin and Freya to learn to read. They were excited. I also asked Odin if I might learn to fight, to defend myself. Odin actually smiled and firmly endorsed it. Freya, being the mother she was, tried to convince both me and her husband to consider. I unfortunately had grown close to her, so I caved, but only for a couple more years, but the learning would begin by the end of the week, or the beginning of the next. I had listened to Freya read me sagas and I had tried to learn the runes and the other words and symbols, but it was not easy. I knew I needed to have an actual teacher for me. But it would be worth it. I also would like to learn magic as well. My mother was well practiced in it. I would ask her to teach me after I learned to read, baby steps. The week flew by quickly and seemed to blur together. Not that I cared too much, I just wanted to get back to my prime. My first life was not so great, but I wanted this life to be better, and it was. I actually had good parents, if one was a little strict and busy, but they both loved and cared for me. That is far more than I can say for my first life. My mother died in childbirth and my father blamed me. He became a drug addict and an alcoholic and physically abusive until I was 16 and joined the Marines. After I joined the Marines, I spent 8 years on the front line. When I was 24, I was selected to go for a secret mission group. It was like Black Ops but exponentially darker. The group was Black Watch. We did the dirty and dangerous jobs that no else could or wanted to. I became head of it. I died about 6 years after. I went to visit my mother's grave, for the first time in over 20 years. I finally got closure after seeing her grave and my father's grave. However, on the way back to the base I was T-boned by a drunk driver and I ended up here. Soon I met the teacher, one of the people who taught Odin himself, Volva. She was old, very old. She looked like a Liberian crossed with a mummy and a prune. Volva was taller than me by about 3 times my own height, and she was a few inches shorter than Odin. Her eyes were sharp, clear and wise. I tilted my head in acknowledgement towards her, unsure of what was still going on, as Odin and her spoke in soft voices and in a language I could not understand. After about 10 or 15 minutes she turned to me as Odin left me alone with Volva. Volva looked down at me and said sternly, "I have been told you wanted to learn to read and to learn about history." I nodded my head and said coolly, "Yes. I want to learn to read and to learn about how everything fell into place to get us where we are. I want to learn about battle strategy. I want to learn." I stared into her eyes, though she was more intimidating than even Odin himself as she stared down into my eyes. Slowly, after a few minutes, she smiled and said warmly, "I like your determination. I hope you do not quit when things get tough." I smirked internally, knowing I was not, but I smiled at her and said, "We shall see, will we not?" Volva said in a corrective way, we shall see." I gave her a stink eye. She said to me, "You will learn respect, fluency and diplomacy." I sighed and nodded my as I said, "Very well." Volva smiled and said, "You may call me Volume if you would like to." I gave a slight nod as I said, "Okay." She hardly paused before she began the story of how my great-grandfather and my grandfather began what happened. Time skip. 10 years, Hades' point of view. I stood with my mother as she tried again to teach me illusions and how to heal. To her surprise, after a couple years of this, you would think she would get the hint. I was not very good at this, but I excelled at summoning and death curses. Freya said with a sigh, "Well, you know, son, not everyone is able to do magic at all, and of those that do, they are good at one. You seem to be the more physical of the two." I gave her a blank look and said, "You don't say, mother." I guessed that when I made a knife appear the first time compared to never being able to make an illusion bigger than myself. I sighed and bowed my head to her. "Sorry, mother, I misspoke. I did not mean to take my frustration out on you, and for that I apologize." She smiled and said, "You are forgiven." She was one of the best at seer and other magic and sorcery, and she was teaching me everything she knew. I was very grateful for that. The sun began to shine through the window, letting us know it was a different time. I sighed and said, "Sorry, mother, I have to go train today with Sif, Tyr and Skadi." Freya sighed and gave me leave to go ahead and go. I closed my eyes and pulled the darkness around me into a tight ball. In my mind's eye I saw the area where I needed to buy.
I saw the shadow of Tyr. I felt myself going at blinding speeds. I felt the cold and some other sensation as I traveled before I jumped out of the shadow behind Tyr, god of war. He jumped and swung his axe at me. I summoned a sword and blocked it as I thrusted my hand forward, sending shadow spikes at him before we both calmed down enough to actually stop acting on instinct. I nodded my head towards the two females, Sif and Skadi. Skadi sighed and said to me, "You know, Hades, you probably should start to leave a lot earlier instead of using your powers or magic to get to your destination." I sighed because I knew she was right, but I wanted to learn more. The more you knew, the more power you had. Wisdom and knowledge is power. I learned that during my first life. I said to her, "Yes, ma'am." I really liked Skadi. She was the goddess of winter, cold, snow and ice, as well as of bow hunting and mountains. She and I got along well. She helped me with my cryokinesis and my archery skills. I still prefer guns over bows, only a few more thousands years before the first guns are made. I asked, "So what are we working on today? You guys did not say what we were going to work on today." Tyr smirked as he said, "You're defensive." I muttered, "Oh Hades. What did you get yourself into this time?" Skadi began to shoot arrows at me so fast her hands looked like a blur. I summoned a shield as it blocked them until the shield split in half, making me wish I had Captain America's shield or something special. I threw the two halves of the shield at her, making her sidestep to the right twice as I began to throw daggers at her, growling, trying to get some blood drawn. Winner is the one who causes the other to bleed. I need to think faster. I only have 3 daggers left. I stopped moving and stared at her. She seemed to have a lot more arrows to go. I somehow had to close the gap. Easier said than done. I growled as I felt myself tiring already. Using my powers and summoning anything drains me, which is why I use them, so I get stronger, so I can last longer. I summoned yet another shield. I needed to end this fight quickly, so I had to charge her. This time I made the shield thicker and stronger. As I charged her, she stayed, holding her ground, making a mistake. As I got closer, I threw the shield at her. This time the shield barely missed her as she ducked under it, but by the time she stood up, I cut her bowstring and held the dagger to her throat. I used the other dagger to make a small poke on her finger, just enough to cause her to bleed. She was breathing slightly harder than before, but I was panting heavily. I muttered, "I win." Skadi chuckled and said, "You're to play defense. You failed to do that." I chuckled in return and said, "No, I say the best defense is a better offense." I smirked at her. I felt the ground shake slightly as I spun around. I saw Tyr walking towards me. He asked, "Are you ready for an actual spar?" He smirked as he held the massive double-bladed war axe. I gulped, feeling tired already, and the fight just began. I sighed and said to him, "Please give me a moment to get a weapon worthy to fight against you. I do not want to fight and have my weapon break on a critical block." Tyr was honorable as fair enough. He nodded towards Sif and said, "Maybe you can ask Sif if you may borrow her blade." I sighed and turned to Sif. I asked her, "Sif, may I please use your sword, please?" She paused before smiling. "Yes, you may." I smiled as she handed to me. Our fingers brushed against each other. I felt warm and fuzzy on the inside, making me uncomfortable. I glared at Tyr as he seemed to know what I was feeling. I growled as I charged him, using the sword's quicker movements to its best advantage against the slower moving axe, but fighting against a god of war is a lot harder than sparring against someone less experienced. I growled as I kept up the onslaught. I was able to keep making him back up. I forced a dagger of crystal to form behind. As I forced him back into it, he simply crushed it like glass. Tyr smirked as he brought his axe down, forcing me to duck and roll. Now it was his turn to go on the offensive. He reminded me of Thor and how fast he was with his hammer Mjolnir, making me play cat and mouse. I had to keep dodging and thrusting the sword to keep him on from a full onslaught. I threw the last 3 daggers at him, making him block them, as charged, hoping for a miracle. But Tyr brought the axe down, disarming me, and then he hit me in the face, breaking my nose and knocking me out cold. Line break, time skip. 15 minutes later, Hades's point of view. I groaned as I slowly came to. When I woke up, I had a mind-splitting headache. I looked around and I was in my room. I stayed laying in my bed, enjoying its comfort as I closed my eyes, trying to figure out where I went wrong during the last spar. I snorted and muttered, maybe going against the god of war was the beginning of a bad idea. I chuckled dryly at my own comment and shook my head as I forced myself to stand back up. I regretted it the moment I did. The world spun around me as I felt faint.
I fell back down onto my bed with a groan. I laid there staying there trying to stop my head from spinning so badly. I closed my eyes as I began to massage my temples. I snuffed out the lights and that seemed to help with part of the headache, but it still roared like a very angry Hulk. I sighed slightly as I could focus enough to mutter a self-healing spell. Those seemed to work better than me trying to heal someone or something else. I chuckled amused knowing I could heal myself but no one else. I was curious about my domains. Curious as in wondering how things were going to play out, if I had more since my name changed so much from Hela or Held to Hades. Did my title change as well as my powers? Or was I the same with a different name? I shook my head again as I began to feel better. I stood up and walked to my bookshelf. I looked over them until I found something I had not read yet. I picked it and walked back to bed as I read the title, How to Tap into Your Inner Power. I shrugged and muttered, worth a shot. I began to read the runes, understanding it as if this was my first language. There were several chapters in it. 1. Know who you are. 2. Spend time in silence. 3. Gain control of your body. 4. Connect with the source of your power. There were more but those seemed important to me. But I knew better than to skip chapters, you would miss knowledge or even warning. Vor taught me that and ingrained it into me. She was much more than what she appeared to be on the outside. She was kind, caring, but stern. She was very wise, perhaps wiser than Odin. She was shrewd and taught me most of what I know. Over the past few years, I spent more time with her and Freya than anyone else. Odin was on a war campaign. He came home along with Tyr. But I seldom saw Odin himself, not that I carried, but deep inside. I wanted my father's approval, even in my former life when I was young and stupid. I sighed as I continued to read the book until I fell asleep. When I woke up it was still dark out. I sat up in bed and looked out of the window. I saw the moon still high in the night sky. I knew it was about midnight, I could just tell. I sighed as I swung my legs over the bed. I could easily see in the dark room. I looked around and found the book I had been reading. I skimmed through the rest of the last couple of pages. I sighed and shook my head as I got and placed the book back where I found it, exactly where I found it. I had everything organized so I could find it in my sleep if I wanted to. I paced along my bookcase. The entire wall was filled with books and scrolls. I hummed softly until I found a book written by Freya. I shrugged and picked it up. I frowned when I opened it. It was entirely blank, and there was no reflection. I muttered, going to give this to Mother and ask her about this book. The door slowly creaked open. I reached under my pillow and pulled out a short sword as I held it in a defensive position as I glared at the door. Finally the door swung fully open, but there was no one there. I frowned but still was on high alert. I swung the sword in front of me but there seemed to be nothing. I sighed and said, I do not think it was the wind. I muttered, Heimdall, do you see something entering my room? I knew he could see and sense just about everything. I could not sense his reply but I had a gut feeling it was nothing, but I was not going to take any chances. I pulled the shadows to me and then I shadowed traveled away towards Heimdall. I appeared in front of him. I sighed and said, Greeting Heimdall. He smiled slightly as he towered over me, Greeting yourself, Your Highness. I chuckled and said, Please call me by my name. We both know we could not do that due to regulations, traditions and such. If I became ruler I was change a few things, but I would rather have been Loki, no responsibilities. But no, I was the eldest. I was born to rule, to lead. I sighed as I sat down on the steps next to him. Heimdall asked, What is on your mind, young prince? I sighed again and said, I do not. I thought I felt someone enter my room. The door creaked open on its own. But there was nothing there. He paused and closed his golden eyes for a few moments before saying after about 5 minutes, he said, I sense nothing. But there could have been something. For a second my sight was blind for a split moment, less than a blink of an eye. I nodded my head and sighed, Thank you for informing me. What do you think happened? Heimdall shrugged his massive shoulders and said, I have no idea, Prince Hades. I sighed and gave him a nod. After a couple of moments I asked, Could we spar please? Heimdall chuckled and said, You just wanted to spar against me, did you not? No, this was not my intention, but I would love to if you were offering. I heard that you were one of the best there ever was. I said, actually excited for another chance to spar against Heimdall. Not to mention that Heimdall uses a sword. I actually like swords and daggers. Those types of weapons really does seem to fit me. He smiled down and said, Very well, summon yourself a good sword. Take your time and get a great sword, not a cheap throwaway one. I nodded my head as I closed my eyes. I focused on the sword itself. I could feel what was right. I made it double edges, straight about 4 inches wide and about 5 feet long. It had a cross guard that was about 4 inches long on each side. It was also sharp and the ends was spiked. The handle was simple but form-fitting in my hand. The pommel was about 2 inches in diameter and it also had a 2-inch spike on the end. The entire sword was black as the night sky void of stars. It slowly formed in my hand. I poured my heart and soul into it. I poured my love, my hate into the sword. I poured darkness into it. Slowly it began to form and take the shape I had in my mind's eye. Soon it was complete, my first true weapon designed and made by me. I smiled as I showed my sword to Heimdall. He gingerly took it from my hand, and it fit his large hand easily as it could fit my 2 hands. He swung it around a little and said, "This sword is perfectly balanced, Prince Hades, and it is made out of a material I have yet seen." I asked, "Do you think it will work for sparring?" Heimdall chuckled and said, "It is better than that, this will even work for me," he said with a warm smile. "You never seem to fail me, you are always bettering yourself." He gently handed it back to me. I asked, "Are you ready, old man?" He smirked as he said, "Are you ready?" Without waiting for me to respond, he drew his sword and swung at me, forcing me to roll to the right and back. I landed on the balls of my feet as I lashed out with my sword. He easily blocked the black blade with ease. He swung down, forcing me to block. I knew if the sword was weak it would shatter, if it was only okay it would snap in half, but if the sword was good, if the sword was excellent, then it would hold out. There was a concussive shock wave as the swords impacted, forcing me to my knees, but the sword held firm. I quickly angled my sword's point down as I used the angle to trap Heimdall's sword down as I went for a headshot kick. But I forgot that he was far stronger than I weighed as he flicked me up into the ceiling of the Bifrost. I grunted when I hit the top. I landed on the ground with a loud thud. I groaned softly as I swayed to my feet. My sword had been lost somewhere in the shadows. Heimdall asked me in a caring voice, "Are you okay, Prince Hades?" I nodded my head as I saw doubled visions. He sighed and said, "Looks like we are done sparring for the night, Your Highness. It is time for you to see your mother about your power and magic training." I sighed as I looked out at the sky. I saw the sky was turning pink. I bowed to him before I shadow traveled back to the palace. Line break, time skipped. 8 hours later, I was mentally drained after training with my mother for the past 7.5 hours. I was resting a little bit as I was allowed to eat some boar and cheese. I sighed tiredly, but I loved spending time with Freya. It was like a lost opportunity that I never had in my first life, and I was taking advantage of that. Not to mention it was increasing my power and skill, which may or may not be my primary goal. Freya was waiting for me in a large private room. In there she taught me more spells and enchantments. I quickly learned that I had a knack for enchantments. I made an endless book that never ran out of pages, which I use so I do not forget who I am and where I came from and what was to happen should I not interfere too much. I chuckled a little as I said to her, "Mother, when can I join the hunt? I am 10 years old now." She smiled and said, "I know, but I would rather have you around a little longer, maybe next year." I sighed and said softly, "Okay mother, but make it 2 years so that I would be 12 and I would learn more from you, everything you have to offer." Freya paused and thought about it heavily. She looked into my icy blue eyes before nodding, "Fair enough, I will do that." I again sighed, not sure why I let her influence me the way she does, but I do know that I truly do love her as the mother I never had and always wanted. The one I have always needed. I smiled slightly and said to Freya, "I love you, mother." She smiled and said to me, "I love you too, my prince." I smiled slightly and said, "Mother, is it true that we all have our own powers and gifts?" Freya sighed and said, "Yes, Hades, everyone on Asgard has their own unique skill, power or gift. Some are more powerful than others." I nodded my head and said, "I think my powers are from darkness and the cold. I have influence on both and you know of the first." "I know, I noticed it when you were born." She sighed and said, "When you were born the lighting around seemed to dim and darken. Your eyes were pitch black and your skin was cold as a frost giant's," Freya said as she reached out and placed a hand on my shoulder. She continued, "You did not wail at first when you were born. And for several hours later." I sighed and nodded my head as I began to process everything that has happened to me. I asked, "When did my eyes become blue?" She smiled a little with a blush and then said, "After your first meal." I blushed as I knew what she meant. I gave her a nod and said, "Thank you, mother." She kissed me on the cheek and said, "You are welcome, my son." She smiled and lightly swatted my shoulder. "Go, it is time for your training." I smiled a little knowing things were going to change. Line break, time skip. 2000 years, Hades' point of view. I pinned Tyr down with ease as I stood up. I looked around and bellowed, "Are you nor entertained?" I looked at Odin. My father, he held no emotions, just a blank slate. His single eye bore into my own eyes. I narrowed my eyes in anger. Someone announced, "Clochelai is the winner," he muttered under his breath. Again. Clochelai means the cold one. I have earned that both literally and figuratively. My real name here since the first battle that happened about 1900 years ago, it became Dor Mor, meaning Fury of Death, or Death Fury. I earned that one as well. It was during the first battle of Jotunheim, home world of the frost giants. I became darkness. I became immune to the cold as I lead the charge. I fought like a demon, destroying everything in front of my. The touch of the giants did not give me frostbite like it did on everyone else, but I was immune to it. And I was like a death incarnate. Though I was not invulnerable, I have a scar from my chest to my stomach when I went to save Skadi from a death blow from behind. I killed the giant dog-like creature. But I needed immediate healing. She called down the Bifrost and carried me to my mother, who was already preparing the healing beds, knowing that wars always caused death and wounds, though she did not think I would be on the front lines. I was in a coma for about a year. Odin was angry that I got myself hurt, not because I was hurt, but rather Freya got mad at him. Odin and I never got along since I told him not to go to war when I went for the Great Hunt. He did not even give me a true weapon, though I had my sword that I still have to this day. Odin got glares from Freya and Valva. I could tell he was in some deep crap. I actually was able to trap and tame the great wolf Fenrir. But my father was never pleased. I broke tradition when I did not kill the wolf, though I killed a bear that attacked me, so I brought back a kill. Ever since then he and I never got along. The only thing we had in common was the desire for war. I felt alive in the battlefield. Over the next century I went to Svartalheim, home of the dwarves. I spent centuries there, leaning everything I could from them, and they helped me create a new weapon. We discussed all types of weapons from spear and trident, to hammer and axe, but we settled on a sword. We made it out of vibranium and uru. We placed several dozen enchantments on it, both from the dwarves and from Asgard and more. I made in such a way unless Odin became what he was in the movies, he would not be able to even touch it, let alone hold it. There were some basic enchantments such as returning to me always, but there were some more advanced enchantments such as summoning black hellfire and coating the blade in black ice, colder than absolute zero, and many more enchantments. I stayed with the dwarves, enjoying their company over my father's, though I did miss Freya. I came home about 10 years ago only to find that he had nearly conquered all 9 realms. I did not care too much because I knew that he had to in order for things to fall into place. That, and the more that died the more power I received, so it was a win-win. Anyways, back to the near present, I won the contest to see who was the most strongest, skilled, powerful. I won the first 2, my Odin won the last one with ease. I was a distant second place. I knew I could become more powerful. I just had to work harder, and longer. I would love to put him in his place. I sighed as I helped my old training partner to his feet. I smiled and said with a light chuckle, "You are getting slow in your old age, Tyr." He laughed and said, "Nay, you are getting quicker and stronger. I taught you everything I know and you have passed me in all ways." He chuckled and said, "Come on, let's go to the feed hall and have a few rounds of ale and some meat." I chuckled and said, "Sounds like a plan, my old friend." I playfully hit his shoulder. I was in a good mood. I was actually very popular among the populace, and of that I was very glad. It would make ruling them easier should I have to rule. Skadi wrapped her arms around me and kissed my cheek as she whispered, "Nice work there, Hades." I smiled and said, "Only a few people still call me that and you are one of them." I kissed her on the forehead and said, "I almost beat you at archery, maybe next time." She snorted and said, "Maybe in 1,000 years." I smirked and said, "That can be arranged, you know." Skadi chuckled and said, "You know I would not mind joining you too at the feast hall." The two of us glanced at Tyr. He smiled fondly and shook his head, "Sure, the more the merrier." The big guy had a huge heart for being one of the gods of war. He lost his left hand when he fed my pet wolf, but he knew that would happen. I never bother asking him that. I looked around for my other friend. She and I were close, but I saw her and Skadi as sisters. I loved them both, but nothing more than sisters, or brothers in arms. Sisters in arms. I could not see her even after we arrived at the bar. Tyr ate and drank far more than I did. I sat in my corner and sipped on a pint of mead, and I had some boar meat and some cheese as watched and listened to everything, always ready to act, always ready to kill. Skadi was talking with one of the guys at the bar. I glared at them, by them, I mean him. I did not like him. I knew he was a flirt and he would break her heart, but he was the son of one of the diplomats, making him too important to kill. Ice began to form around me and around him. Skadi was used to the cold, so she did not notice it. When I did, I sighed and pulled it all back, turning it to an ice knife. I sighed and shattered it against the stone floor. I sighed and said to Tyr and Skadi separately, I have to go, I have to meet with mother. And that was true. I told her I would meet with her after the contest and after I came back from my self-exile. I shook my head away from those thoughts and chugged the rest of my mead and said, thanks for the mead and meat, Tyr. I smiled as he was having a drinking contest with someone and was winning by a landslide. I left the hall of feasting to go to the palace where my mother should be waiting for me. I really do hope I did not keep her waiting too long. That would not be good, especially for my health. I quickly shadow stepped there to avoid keeping her waiting any longer than I had to. I smiled slightly when I saw her. She smiled brightly when she saw me. I said softly to her, I have missed you, mother. She came closer to me. I thought she was going to hug me, but first she slapped my heart across the cheek and said, 1,000 years and only 100 letters? I gulped nervously before she hugged me tightly. She said, I missed you too, my son. I smiled as I closed my eyes and hugged her back. Freya let me go and asked, how have you been in all of these years? I smiled and said, I am well. I crafted a new blade for myself and I also got some new armor that was a gift from the dwarves. She cocked her head and asked, may I see the armor please? I chuckled as I slammed my sword into the ground, and in a flash of darkness I was in my armor. It was wet ink black and was smooth as polished riverstone. The breastplate was made out of vibranium, as was the helmet. The greaves that protected my shins were made out of Asgardian steel. The gauntlet was made out of uru and vibranium, as was the part that protected my forearms. The fingered to a razor's point. I had no cape as per my request. The armor had many enchantments to hit, making it similar to my sword. Freya gave a low whisper and said, impressive son, very impressive. I chuckled as I removed the helmet and it faded back into the armor. I sheathed the sword and the armor turned into a black cloak made up Asgardian leather. I smiled as I loved the armor and weapons and I liked to show it off. I turned to Freya and said with a small smirk, I sense that there is a new life. Is it a boy or a girl? I am hoping for a little brother. Freya blushed slightly and said, we are not sure yet, I am hoping for a girl. It might soften Odin up. I growled slightly and said, or he will turn her into a monster like he nearly did with me. Pray he gains wisdom lest something happened to him. My voice turned cold and my eyes went black as I thought of everything Odin had done to me. Freya sighed and gently shook me back to reality as she said, my son, you have to forgive your father. I sighed and bowed to her, as you wish, my queen. I smirked at her annoyed look and chuckled amused at her. I added, Freya, when do you think he will be born? She asked me, with a smile. I told you we do not know what it will be. I shrugged and said, I am not calling the baby and it's so yes he. She shrugged and said, fair enough. I smiled a little bit more, enjoying my time with my mother, especially because I never knew my own mother. I yawned and stretched my arms and back as I said, I will retire to my quarters, mother. That is if you approve. Freya smiled and said, go get some rest, young prince. Line break, time skip. 100 years. Hades' Clochali's, Dor Mor's point of view. Thor has been born for about 50 years and Loki was found about 40 years ago. They were truly brothers, fought each other, they helped each other. Since Odin adopted Loki, he changed. It took me nearly destroying the entire world for him to see the hell of war and what I was telling him about the price of war. I made it a very bloody battle with only my close friends and their friends surviving. Everyone else was killed alongside the enemy. I am not saying it was right, But Odin needed something to wake him up from the delusion he had, and that did it. I spent the last 50 years in Alfheim, the home world of the Light Elves. They were excellent at archery, the way of the bow and arrow. I learned more from them, though not as much as I did from the dwarves. Though these elves were far more pleasant on the eyes and ears than the dwarves ever were. Though the dwarves had enough food for me. I was on my way home to see the family. Odin and I were still distant, but we could be in the same room and we could talk without a fight starting after, so it was a good thing, though neither of us still cared for the other, or that is what I can get from him. Odin can mask his feelings far better than I ever could. Freya had a soft spot for Loki and Odin cared for both of them, though Thor seemed to get more attention than I ever did. Was I jealous? Nope, I am glad for him. Besides, I have always been more of a loner. Even in my own world I had a few friends, but they all ended up leaving me. Or dying and then leaving me. I called out, "Heimdall! Take me home." In a bright flash of rainbow-colored light I was pulled up towards Asgard. Moments later I appeared in the Golden Dome in Asgard. I smiled at the golden-clad gatekeeper and said, "Greetings, my old friend." He bowed to me and said, "And to you as well, your highness." I sighed and asked, "How have things been here?" Heimdall paused and said, "About the same as it always has been." I sighed and gave him a nod and said, "Thank you," after saying that I made my way back to the palace. I sighed as I actually walked to the palace. I would rather be anywhere in the universe than be near my father Odin. But I knew my mother Freya wanted to see me and I pushed my luck too far once in the past. And let's say I am never, ever doing that again. I closed my eyes briefly, remembering the last time I was here. Thor got the hammer. If I recall, he renamed it to Mjolnir. I did not care too much, but it was important to me that he did. I wanted to protect him, but I was afraid of influencing him too much and changing everything I knew that might happen. I told the just last century I forfeit my birthright of the throne. I did not want it. Odin was beyond anger and rage. He took Freya to calm him down, but since then he and I can scarcely be in the same room alone lest there be a war. He was more powerful than I. But I knew to wait till he was in his Odin sleep, where he was pretty much in a coma and defenseless, if I wanted to kill him. But I did not want to. I saw how he was changing with Thor and Loki. I wanted to be there for Loki since he was already in the shadows. If it was not for Freya he would have been alone. I shook my head and sighed as these thoughts coursed through my veins. My blood was cold as ice as I muttered, "I hope this goes better, a lot better than it did last time." A few moments later I had walked to the entrance. There seemed to be no one around. That made me even more cautious. I shadow-stepped, turning to smoke and dust, and reappeared in my room's closet. As I came out I had a gut feeling something was amiss. As I wandered throughout the palace there seemed to be no one. I frowned slightly, very curious on what was going on. I felt something leading me to the hall of feasting. I quickly followed my gut feeling, as it has never let me down before, even in my old life. It had saved me countless times, and it has yet to prove to be useless here in this life, in this universe. Once I rounded the corner, surprise! Everyone shouted at once, nearly giving me a heart attack and nearly causing me to lash out in self-defense. I asked loudly, "What the hell is going on here?" Freya gave me a look that said that the children were listening to me, though I did not see a point in keeping my language down to a kid's. They grow up fast, and I know Odin cusses and curses worse than the dwarves. Freya sighed and said, "Today is your birthday, do not tell me you forgot your own birthday." I shrugged and said, "I do not keep track of that, to me it is pointless, we are another day older and that is it." "I am sorry, mother, if that offends you. Though it is a reason to see you." I gave her a small smile. Thor and Loki rushed out of the crowd and hugged me. They looked to be about 8 and 5 respectively. I chuckled softly and hugged them. "Hey baby brothers." Thor huffed and said, "I am not a baby." I chuckled and said, Both of you will always be my baby brother." Loki chuckled amused and said, "Okay, old man." I smirked, liking Loki, not as old as the old man Odin. I heard Odin huff slightly, but I saw a small smile on his lips. Thor laughed a little at the joke I had made, causing the entire crowd to smile a little bit. Loki shook his head at Thor and asked me, "So Clochelai, what have you done lately?" I chuckled and said, "Always thirsting for knowledge. I hope you do not change, Loki, and brother, you can call me Hades if you want." I smiled and ruffled his long black hair and said, "Should I tell the tale to all?" I got a cheer from the crowd. I chuckled and said, "One of battle or one of diplomacy?" The crowd roared, Battle. I sighed, mentally cursing myself for giving them an option. I had tried to be peaceful for the past millennium, and battling is not one of them. Though Loki is not the only gifted lair in this world. So I smiled and said, "Okay, you win. A battle you want. A battle you get." I took a deep breath and said, "I was traveling the 9 realms when I went to Jotunheim, the home world of the frost giants." I glanced slightly at Loki as I scanned the crowd reading them. Line break, flashback, location. Jotunheim. Hades, Clochali's point of view. I stared and looked around me in the frozen wasteland, nothing but snow, ice and stone for as far as the eye could see. I called out to the lord of this realm, the king of the frost giants, Laufey. I greeted him by bowing to him, as everyone is king in their own home and world. "Greetings, King Laufey the First, come in peace. Away from my father's house." He glared down at me in a mix of anger and fear. "Why are you here? What brings you to this realm? War? You slaughtered nearly all of us?" I sighed and said, "We were at war. And it was by my father's, Lord Odin, king of Asgard, ruler of the 9 realms, will that I did what I did. I even killed my own for him to see the truth of war. I killed many of my men for there to be peace. I came here in peace. I came here to learn from your people and your ways." He snorted in my direction and said, "You lie well." I growled and said, "I do not want to fight. I came here to learn. If I am to be king or ruler, I need to know every realm and their own strengths and weaknesses. I have lived with the dwarves for a couple thousand years. I spent several centuries with the light elves. I have scouted Midgard for dozens of years. This is one of the only realms I need to learn from." King Laufey paused and said, "It seems that truth rings in your words. I sense no lies in you nor deceit." His frozen armor and ice weapon looked at me with the blood eyes. I met his eyes as I said, "I am not your enemy. I swear, if I wanted war, I would have killed you all by now. I am here talking for knowledge." He paused and said, "Then, what if you learned everything? Then what? You destroy us." I sighed, bored of him. "No, my lord. I learn and I stay and then I leave. Once I leave I will not return unless to learn more or to negotiate trade, or something along those lines." The king paused and nodded. "Very well, we have nothing to lose." I chuckled dryly and then said, "That you do not." Line break, flashback, location. Jotunheim. Hades, Clochali's point of view. I spent several decades on Jotunheim, learning everything that I could from them. They had a very unique magic compared to everything else I knew, but it was still potent in its own way. I never would have thought they were so powerful until I was there and learned from them. We all knew the cold is where they thrived. They approved of my title, Clochali, or the Cold One. They agreed that their magic seemed to flow through me, and I as requested stayed to myself in their library or talking with the king. I absorbed knowledge like a sponge, learning everything they taught me. I earned some respect from Laufey, if not some trust, since I have been there for over 200 years. I was summoned before the king by one of his servants. I wore my simple black cloak with all of the enchantments on it, ever ready for battle. Once I arrived there, the king stood up from the icy throne as I bowed to him. "Lord Laufey," making sure I was respectful to him so to keep the peace up between us. He looked down at me and said, "We have a quest for you, something that only the eldest of warrior clans do. We have a beast that needs destroyed. Many have died. Now I call upon you to do this task." His blood-red eyes met my own icy blue eyes. I asked, "Why send an outsider? Why send me? To kill me?" I paused and added, "Or to earn the trust of the people? To appease all?" Laufey said, "Yes to all of the above." He stood up from his icy throne and walked down the icy steps. I was forced to look up to him, for he was much more than 2 feet taller than me as he looked down at me. I kept my temper under control, knowing full well a lashing out would not end well. If I did not, it could mean war, if not death. Line break, time. Present, location, Asgard. Hades, Clochali's point of view. I glared at Eric, who interrupted my storytelling. Eric said, yelling, "I thought you said a battle. A battle, where is the glory you?" I growled lowly and said, "I was getting there, bastard." Smack. Freya slapped my cheek for cussing in front of everyone. I sighed but said nothing for a few minutes until I knew I could speak without anger. I was going to get there. I just needed to set the scene. And I thought Odin would like a report on the frost giants, so my story is doing far more than entertaining.
I sighed and shook my head, already tired of the company. If today was my birthday, I wanted to be left alone as my present, to be left at peace. Eric snorted and said, "You have lost your edge, Hades." I snarled and a cold wind blasted through the crowd. I said icily as I formed a sword of ice, "You may call me Clochuli." My voice was as cold as the Arctic and soft as the falling snow. Everyone began to shiver from the cold save for Odin and Loki. I huffed annoyed as I forced the cold back in within me to save for another time. Odin glared at me with his one eye and asked me, "Tell me where you learnt that." I snorted and said, "Why should I tell you? If I said I learned it on my own you would call me a liar. If I told you it were the frost giants you would demand either me or them to tell you." I glared at him and said, "You know my name is Clochuli, the cold one. I learned how to manifest it outwards even better than before." Forseti spoke up and said, "He speaks the truth." Forseti was the god of justice, peace and truth. I gave him a thankful nod. Odin glared at me and said, "Very well." I sighed, already tired of the so-called party, ready to leave and go to the forge to finish making some knives and daggers for Loki. I was about done with them. I made them with his people's enchantment, meaning only he and I would be able to touch them without risk of frostbite, plus a few others. I also made Thor an axe, Stormbreaker, but only when he became king. A worthy king would I give that to him. Thor shouted to me, "Brother, can you please continue the tale?" I sighed and asked, "Okay. But where was I?" Loki answered me, "You were about to go on a quest to kill some beast or monster." I nodded my thanks to him and said, "King Laufey of the Frost Giants sent me on an urgent quest." Line break, flashback, location, Jotunheim. Hades, Clochuli's point of view. The king paused and nodded. "Very well, we have nothing to lose." I chuckled dryly and then said, "That you do not." I sighed and said, "Very well, I will go on this so-called quest." The king nodded to me and said, "You have my gratitude. If you survive I myself will teach you." I gave him a nod and said, "Sound reasonable and fair. But swear to me that you will keep your word." Laufey nodded and said, "I Laufey, king of Jotunheim, swears to train Clochuli should he defeat the beast and come back alive, lest I forfeit the crown to him." I was shocked he swore on the crown, but I knew he would keep it now, unless I died, and stayed dead. I was given 3 days to pack and prepare. It was times like there was when I wish I knew the sling ring, but of course I am too far behind time for that. Humans are now barely in the Stone Age. I got my armor on plus my cloak. I had dual swords at my sides. I had a shield made of uru and vibranium on my back. It was painted pitch black. I did not make the shield, but the dwarves made it for me. I made an ice mirror and looked into it. I saw myself and I approved of the armor. I was warm in the armor and cloak and it seemed to flow nicely. I sighed and muttered to myself, "Well, this is it." I stood up and began to march towards the throne room to inform Laufey I was ready to leave. However, once I got there it seemed most all of the royals, noble were there. I stood straight up and said, "I am ready to leave, King Laufey." He looked down from his throne and nodded his head. "The beast is a giant, 10 times as tall as I am and much stronger than I. It has a pet 4 times the size of our icy mounts. The giant is located as far east as you can go." I gave a single nod and asked, "Anything I should know about it?" He said, "Yes, if it seems dead, kill it again. That goes for the both of them." I thought that was strange, but I had nothing to back me up, so I nodded and said, "As you wish." Without another word I shadow traveled outside of the icy palace, which reminded me of a tomb for some reason or another. I made sure I was walking east and I began my trek towards the dark Twin Peaks. Line break, flashback, location, Jotunheim. Hades, Clochuli's point of view. It took me a week of jogging to get there, but I made it there, the valley between the 2 dark peaks. But once I made it there I could feel a chill in my gut. I felt an evil like nothing I have ever felt before. I called out into the darkness that seemed to try to swallow me, "Show yourself to me." If Laufey was 20 feet tall, then this monster would be 200 feet tall. I should have brought a gun, a really, really big gun. I saw a shadow move and I drew one of my swords and I got M-shield out. I shadow traveled away to outside the peak and realized there was an enchantment, a spell around there. I muttered a curse when I saw that the giant was closer to 450 feet tall and it was laying in the snow, but it had 2 heads. The 2 peaks, one of each head.
Slowly it began to rise to his full height. I felt like a spider, about to be crushed. I sheathed my sword and drew the other and it caught on fire, the black flames from hellfire. I threw the sword and it went into the eye and brain where it quickly melted the head. The body fell down. I thought it would have been over as I walked on the chest, but I forgot about one head. The right head. Soon the right arm quickly slapped down onto me. If it were not my shield I would have been crushed. I knew now why Laufey had meant when he said kill it twice. I summoned my sword and it cut a hole through the jaw of the left head, but it seemed to be healing without it in there. I realized that the cold was empowering it. I shouted as loud as I could, Heimdall send me to Muspelheim, the fire realm. I jumped between the two heads as the Bifrost transported the giant and I to Muspelheim, where Suture was the fire demon. I shadow traveled back to Jotunheim where I was back in my room. I put up the armor back into a cloak form as I was wearing 2 cloaks now. I walked to the king and threw open the doors of the throne room and said, I have slayed the 2-headed giant, I declared. Everyone cheered but Laufey. He asked me, did you bring back anything to prove it? I smirked and said, I melted him with hellfire, there was nothing but vapor. If he comes back, get me and I will try something else. All shuddered at the dark malice-filled look I had. King Laufey seemed to have believed me as he too smiled, to Clochelai the Risaster Moringi the giant slayer. I sighed and asked, my lord, may I retire to my quarters? I am in need of recharging, I am tired. He gave me a nod and allowed me to leave. Line break. Present, location. Asgard, Hades, Clochelai's point of view. I was once again interrupted this time by Thor, so you lied. I sighed and said, no, heat was the giant's weakness, he will melt in the fire realm become destroyed or weak. I did not say my name so I should be an unknown so he cannot have revenge by taking it out on you. And then it helps dampen the fire realm making it weaker slightly plausibly. Odin glared at me with his one eye then said, so you used the Bifrost for an enemy of Asgard. I glared back at him in return and said, I was spreading peace with the frost giants, and sowing war where war already was. Freya sighed annoyed and stepped between us. Maybe this story should not be told seeing how it can't make anyone very happy. I bowed to her in gratitude. I was tired of telling the story with all of the interruptions. I smiled towards her and said, thank you mother. She smiled and nodded slightly at me. Odin sighed and said, happy birthday Hades. I glared at him and said, only a few people may call me by that name. My name is Clochelai Trenumd demeaning the other name lowly. My eyes burned coldly with rage. He sighed and shook his head and I did the same and said, why am I here Odin? We both know my self-exile has made peace between the family, and I do not care for being in one place for too long. I do not like strife and that is all I seem to get from you. So why would I come? I only came for my mother's sake and the sake of my brothers. Odin sighed and said, you are my firstborn son. I love you. I know when you were younger. I forced you to do many things that you did not want to do. As a king the first did it for Asgard. But as a father, I am sorry. I sighed and said, I forgive you. Father, do not assume I will be your son as I was before. It takes time to heal wounds of the past and for relationships to mend. Odin gave me a nod and said, all I can ask is you give me a chance, son. A ghost of a smile pulled my lips upwards slightly. Line break, time skip. 3 days later, location, Asgard. Hades, Clochelai's point of view. I ducked under a dagger and fired an ice blast making Loki roll out of cover. Thor flew down from the top of the wall and flew down at me with his hammer Mjolnir with lightning trailing it. I rolled backwards and dodged the strike. I threw dark spikes at him and he spun his hammer as fast as he could and blocked every one of the projectiles. I spun around and grabbed Loki by his throat and threw him at Thor who barely had time to stop spinning Mjolnir and catch Loki. Thor caught Loki, but they both hit the ground. By the time they righted themselves I had 2 swords on their neck, one for each neck. I chuckled and helped them up, you guys are getting stronger every time we meet. Thor huffed and said, you always beat us, Loki added helping me, but we last a little longer every single time. I nodded and said, yes, remember I am eldest so my powers will always be over you, but you can become stronger by practice and training. I looked to both of them as I said that. Loki sighed and said, I am never going to be physically as strong as you or Thor will I?
I sighed and said, physically? Not likely, but more powerful? Plausibly. Thor glared at me and Loki. I huffed and said, Thor, you are god of lightning and thunder. You are very powerful. But if you get cocky and do not train, you will be passed up by even as Midgardian, an earthling. He sighed and said, I apologize for thinking you were playing favorites Hades. I smiled and said, what are brothers for? I want both of you to be as powerful as both of you can be. You two are very different. You hold power differently than Loki does. Loki asked, can you teach me more magic? Freya taught me all she knows. I chuckled and said, maybe when you are a little more older, but keep reading and you will go far. Thor asked me, can you train me, please? I sighed and said, maybe later, I need some food and I have a meeting with Odin soon. Loki said, you were going easy on us, were you not? You knew you could beat us and have time to meet up with father after. I shrugged and said, yup, I knew I could beat you, but by no means was I going easy. They both gave me a nod before I bid them farewell for now. I was telling them the truth, but the only reason why I was not going easy was because I was afraid of hurting them or even killing if I went all out. I was hoping by train Loki I would stop him from going evil, and by training Thor I would not make him jealous and accidentally send him to Thanos' side. I did not want to make either one evil, so I could not treat one overly fondly. Odin treated Thor special and Freya treated Loki special, but they both wanted the other's attention, but I filled that fatherly figure to them being an older male role model. I did not say I was a good one, but on Asgard and around them I would try to keep clean. I did not want to lead them astray. A few minutes later I arrived in the library where Odin was waiting for me. I asked him with a sigh, what do you want, Odin? He sighed and said, I know you were not happy about your childhood. I shrugged and said, we were at war. It could have been worse, far worse. I enjoyed traveling. Odin nodded once and said, son, if you could have anything in the world, what would you desire? I sighed and said, nothing, all father. I am content with what I have and what I am. Odin sighed as he sensed the truth. He paused and nodded, very well. Was there a gift you were going to give me? I asked, curious now. Odin gave me a wry grin and said, maybe. I chuckled and said, is this for all the birthdays you missed? Odin sighed and said, partly, the other part was that I was never there for you when you were a kid. I gave Thor a great warhammer and Loki a scepter. I gave him a single nod and said, I know. I gave Loki some daggers with some small enchantments on them and Thor a cape that will keep him warm and would add protection to his back. All-Father sighed and then said, I know you love them like sons. I am glad they have you to look up to. I glared at him and said, Loki needs you too. He desires your attention and approval. Yet you favor Thor, your second-born, compared the adopted son, child of Laufey, king of the frost giants. I sighed and said, Loki should know that he is a frost giant before he finds out on his own. I will tell him if you do not. Odin sighed and put a hand on his face and slowly wiped down as he said, I know I need to tell him soon, but. I cut him off and said, but you are afraid. I paused and then added, but the longer you wait the worse it will be in the long run. I looked into his eye as I said that. Odin gave me a single nod as he said, I know that, but still. I sighed and said, you should tell him, but I will if I must. Hades's, Clochali's, Dormor's, point of view. I sighed and said to my father, you should tell Loki about his true bloodline, but if you do not, I will if I must. I said, glaring into his one eye. Odin sighed and gave me a grave nod, knowing I was right and I was too stubborn to be told otherwise. I took an icy breath and said, Father, I am going to Midgard soon. I first want to make myself something for the trip there. Odin arched an eyebrow and cocked his head, curious. I smirked and said, not telling you what it is till I make it, father. He rolled his eye and muttered something under his breath, making me chuckle lightly. I sighed and said, Father, I do respect you. Loki and Thor both want your approval, your blessing. Both also wants the throne. I know for a fact that you favor Thor over me and over Loki. Ask yourself why. Why take him from the icy war zone? War choose a hot-headed fool for a king. Why reject me? After saying my piece I shadowed traveled away to my room. I glared at Loki and said, what are you doing here in my room? He rolled his eyes and said, you literally have a library in your room and you expect me not to read? You have written some interesting stuff and I cannot understand some of the writings that you wrote.
as in it was not in any language I know of. I gave him a nod and said, "You will learn it eventually on your own, it will just take time." I said, half lying half and half telling the truth. Loki huffed and asked, "When you go to Midgard, can you take me with you, please?" I sighed and knew it was too early for them, Loki and Thor, to go to Earth, but they did not understand that, nor would they. I sighed and patted his back. "Loki, my brother, you are like a son to me. I wish I could. But these creatures are so puny and weak, you and Thor. Mainly Thor would kill them on accident. I trust you more than him, but I am the only one that is ready to walk among them. For now, wait 1,000 years and yes, you will come with me if you desire to." Loki seemed to perk up slightly as I said that. I smiled at him and said, "Yes, I give you my wood, Loki Odinson." Loki quickly hugged me, making me chuckle as I returned the gesture. I looked up and saw Freya in the doorway with a smile. I smiled and said, "Hello mother, how are you this evening?" She smiled and said, "I am faring well. I came to see where my sons were and I found 2 of them." Freya chuckled and said, "Tomorrow I will show you, both of you, some more tricks and magics and sorceries." Loki grinned, excited for it. I chuckled amused at him and said to mother, "I think Loki and I would love to practice, if not spar with you. Maybe we should invite Thor. I know he does not like it, but still we should offer." Freya smiled and said, "You are always looking out for your family, especially your brothers." I smiled and shook my head, amused, knowing that Hela should have been banished not long ago and she would have tried to kill Thor and Loki, but now I am just trying to keep both Thor and Loki on the right path, not working with Thanos. I knew right now I was still too weak to take him on even now. "Are you okay, Hades?" Freya asked me. "You seem to be in some deep thought." I chuckled and said, "Yes, I was just in some deep thought, thinking on what could have been." I smiled at them both and said, "I am glad that things are working out mostly well. I am glad I have had time to travel the universe without having to worry about war. I learned much more as I was than I could in a library." I glanced at Loki and added, "But a library is good, never forget about it first." Loki snorted amused and said, "The library is my second room and your room is my third room." I shook my head amused at his antics, but smiled lovingly at my little brother, but I said nothing. "So Hades, where have you gone in all of your journeys?" Loki asked me, but Freya also leaned in curious as well. I sighed and said, "I have been to all 9 realms. I spent time on most of the worlds such as Midgard, Asgard, Niflheim, Nidavellir, Jotunheim, Alfheim, Vanaheim, Svartalheim, among others." I smiled, remembering my time with the dwarves and the light elves. I smiled and said, "I learned a lot from the dwarves in smithing and enchantments. I learned even more about archery from the light elves. I learned the cold brutality of Jotunheim. Only the strong may survive, the weak will die. The what does not kill you will always make you stronger. If you adapt. If you evolve." Loki frowned and said, "The weak should have an equal chance at living as the strong. Sometimes the runt of the litter becomes the largest of them all." I smiled and said, placing a hand on his shoulder, "I know Loki, I know." Freya smiled at the 2 of us and said, "I think it is late enough, we will train early, you 2 best get some rest." I sighed and then yawned as I gave her a nod. "I agree, mother." Loki pouted a little, making me smile. "Come now, Loki, it is getting late and I am tired. The sooner you fall asleep the sooner dawn will break." Loki sighed and nodded. "Good night, brother." I gave him a nod and said, "Good night, Loki." I smiled and said, "You're like a son to me, Loki. You and I have a lot in common." Loki yawned and nodded his head before he bade me farewell, as did our mother. Line break. Time skip. A few hours later. Hades's, Clochali's, Dor Mor's point of view. I woke up a few hours before Freya would come and wake me. I smiled and summoned a modern pen as I began to write in another journal, hoping that I would never forget my first life. I wrote for a couple of hours before I had my fill of writing. I put the journal in a pocket dimension. After writing I began to practice using hellfire on my blades, and it was very, very effective. I turned up the heat and turned down the color so that the flames were black and the heat was at an impossible heat. I growled as I sparred in the old room. I fired flames out of my mouth and out through the open window. I was panting heavily as I stopped. I smiled, feeling the tired hive after workout. All of a sudden I heard people clapping behind me. I slowly turned around and saw Freya. Loki and Thor all clapping at me, though I saw some jealousy in Thor's eyes. I cocked my head and asked, "Why are you guys here, in my room?" Freya said, "I was going to wake you up, but we saw you practicing, so we chose to watch you." Loki smirked and said, "That was pretty hot, brother. Maybe you should have done ice, now that would have been pretty cool." Thor face-palmed at Loki's joke, but I chuckled at the two of them. Thor glared at me, I gave him an annoyed look and said, "You control lightning and the weather. If you studied it you could control what makes lightning. You could have even more control than you have now. You could hold even more power, yet you hold yourself back." I shook my head and said, "Give me your hammer and I will go outside and show you what you may be able to do." The weather grew cloudy as Thor glared at me. Freya sighed and shook her head at us and Loki looked amused that a fight may be happening. I sighed along without Mother and said, "Mother, perhaps we should spar first, then maybe practice the illusions and other magic with you. But first boys must be boys." She gave me a nod as thunder rolled over the distance. Loki rolled his eyes at Thor's dramatic. Thor gave me a stiff nod and said, "I will show you the power of the mighty Thor." I snorted and said, "And they call me the Grim Reaper. I shall be your Undertaker." Loki simply looked amused at the chaos being sowed by Thor and by myself as he stood just behind Freya. Loki muttered, "What the hell is an Undertaker?" Thor turned red with rage as he glared at me with anger and pride. I glared at him and said, "Why are you against me? Why are you jealous?" I raised my voice as the darkness shook and grew like a cage rattling. Thor raised his voice and then said, "You think yourself above me. You think you are more powerful than I am Thor, Odin's son." I glared at him and said, "I am Odin's firstborn, I am Dur than you. I am more powerful than you," I said with a hint of a growl in my tone. Loki simply looked amused at us. Freya then stepped in and said, "Enough, both of you." I sighed and backed up to my bed and sat down on it. I could not bear Thor's pride and arrogance. It made me want to break him down, but I knew that would push him down the wrong path. It would put him on the road to Thanos. That was a road that I did not want to go down, though Loki seems to be doing really well in this timeline. Thor was still grizzled, but he also backed down to the doorway. I sighed and said, "It appears my welcome has worn out, Mother. I will return in due time." Without waiting for her response, Shadow stepped away, then appeared in front of Heimdall. I smiled at him and said, "How are you doing, my old friend?" He smiled warmly and said, "I am well, my prince." I gave him a nod and said, "I am glad to hear that." I sighed and said after a short pause, "I wish I could stay and chat, but I must go." Heimdall said with a stoic face, "You faced down armies alone. You stood up to your father Odin, yet you are running away from your family? Why?" I sighed and shook my head. "I am not in the mood to discuss my problems, or the reasons behind I do what I do, Keeper of the Bifrost." He gave me a nod, knowing not to push me, as he asked, "Where to, my prince?" I immediately answered, "To the dwarves. I want to make something." "Your wish is my command," Heimdall said as he gave me a nod as he turned on the Bifrost. I felt the rainbow bridge shoot me across the galaxy to one of the forges where Eitri was, the king of the dwarves, the master of the smiths. I appeared in their back room. I smiled when I saw the giant and said with a slight bow, "Eitri." "Hades, Hades, my old friend," he said, walking towards me in great strides, closing the gap between us in mere moments as he wrapped me in a bone-crushing hug. If I was a human. I chuckled and hugged him in return as I said, "It is good to see you too, my friend." He put me down but was still smiling at me. I sighed and said, "I missed this place." He chuckled and said, "I know that you are not like the rest of your family, nor are you like my people." I gave him a nod and said, "Well said, my old friend, well said." Eitri sighed and asked, "What made you come here this time?" He looked deep into my eyes. I thought about lying but chose not to. I trusted him enough not to, as I said, "A fight with my brothers and my father, and I wanted to make some things, a ring to be precise. Not a normal ring, but one that is enchanted." He frowned and said, "What use do you want from it?" I smiled and said with a chuckle, "I want it to make any who wears it becomes as weak as a Midgardian, an Earthling, but I want the ring to always come back to me when I call it. But should a Midgardian is worthy, I want them to hold more power. Not all of my power, but part of it, not sure yet, or whomever wore the ring before." I paused as I thought of it. "It would give me a life again," I added, "and I want the ring to also act as a homing beacon for myself and Heimdall." I sighed and said, But I want the ring to keep the lifespan the same for me to wear it, but give a long life to a human who wears it." The king of the dwarves looked at me and asked, "Why do you plan on making this ring? Why humans? Why make you weaker or a powerful race weak, but make the humans, or other human-like species that are weak to become stronger?" I answered him and said, "I want it to be like a training. I would become as weak or as strong as a normal human, and I could become stronger. The longer the ring is on, the more power that is building up inside of me wanting to be let out, making me more powerful and stronger in the long run." Eitri sighed and said, "Sounds fair and easy to do. What do you want it to be made of and the looks?" I chuckled and said, "Vibranium, uru and unobtainium. I want it to be a simple ring, no gem. Just a golden and silvery look that intertwine." He smiled just slightly and said, "That should be easy enough." I smiled and said, "Thank you, my friend." Eitri smiled and said, "Think nothing of it, my friend." Line break, time skip. 3 days later, Hades's, Clochali's, Dor Mor's, point of view. I was making the final touches on a dagger full of ice magic and enchantments for Loki as the giant of a man entered the room. Eitri smirked and said, "It is finished." I looked up and saw him with a ring that looked like 2 dragons chasing the other's tail, twirling in a dance. One was gold, the other was silver. If you looked closely you could see a bronze line between the dragon, forever separating them, keeping from touching. I gave a low whistle when I saw it as he handed it to me. I gently took it and admired its beauty. I smiled and said, "It is beautiful." I paused and said, "But did you put everything in I asked for, Eitri?" Eitri gave me a nod and said, "Yes, my old friend. I have the enchantments and the martial in there. I also took liberty to make it a bit more artistic by adding the dragons." I gave him a nod and said, "I see that. I see the dragons and how they make the rain pop, for lack of a better term." The dwarf king chuckled and said, "I see I left you speechless, and that does not often happen." I gave him a nod as I said, "You are right, my old friend, you went above and beyond what I asked you to do. Excellent. You did a great job with the rain." He gave me a nod, still smiling, proud of his work, and I was still in awe of the rain. I could feel its power slowly waning as it drew it into itself. Soon it felt like a normal rain, but I could feel something amiss about it if I did not know what it was before. I smiled and said, "Thank you again, my friend." He sighed and said, "You have said that already. I am glad it pleases you, but I have to get back to work." I gave him a nod as he gave himself leave. I stood there alone in my room with the rain. I sighed as I went into my room. With my ring I knew the ring had a lot of promise to do good, and a smaller chance to be used as evil due to the layers and chance on it. I plopped onto my bed and closed my eyes as I fell into a light sleep. I woke a few hours later feeling much more refreshed than I have in a while. I went to the library where I found Loki. Loki said to me, "Brother, did you know?" I asked him, confused. "What do you mean, did I know?" He sighed, and his body turned blue with red eyes. Yes, I did know." I replied in a soft tone. I asked him, "When did they tell you?" I sighed as I went into my room. With my ring I knew the ring had a lot of promise to do good, and a smaller chance to be used as evil due to the layers and chance on it. I plopped onto my bed and closed my eyes as I fell into a light sleep. I woke a few hours later feeling much more refreshed than I have in a while. I went to the library where I found Loki. Loki said to me, "Brother, did you know?" I asked him, confused. "What do you mean, did I know?" He sighed, and his body turned blue with red eyes. Yes, I did know." I replied in a soft tone. I asked him, "When did they tell you?" Loki sighed and said to me in a soft tone, "Last week, and I have not seen them since then. I have been avoiding both mother and father." I chuckled and asked him, "And what did they tell you? Do you mind telling me?" He sighed and said, "It started a few days or weeks after I was born." Line break, flashback, third-person point of view. A battle raged on in the world of Jotunheim. The war was costly on both sides. It would seem that death is on neither side in this conflict as people from both sides were dropping like flies. Hades seemed to have a grand time as he slaughtered more than any other with obsidian spike erupting from the grind like giant blades. Yet that did not stop the frost giants trying to attack his allies. They stayed clear the god of death. The battle raged on for some weeks before it slowed to a crawl with only Hades on the front line. Odin went to one of the temples when he heard a babe's squeal. He mused to himself, Who would leave a child, no less a baby, out in this weather on the battlefield? He got closer, and he found a child that was blue and had red eyes. Odin had already had his fill of death, and this babe was innocent. Odin bent down to pick him up and the baby shape shifted into an Aesir, as if he had trusted Odin to protect it from harm. Odin could tell it was a son of Laufey, but that did not matter, the babe was innocent, so Odin took him back to Asgard after naming him Loki. Line break. Present time, Hades' Clochali's, Dormor's point of view. I knew the story all too well, I was there when it happened. I sighed and gave Loki a hug and then whispered in his ear, "Thank you for telling me this." Loki sighed and then said softly, "We are not brothers." I sighed in return and said in a firm tone, "We are closer than brothers. You and I get along better than Thor and I do. I sometimes feel as though you were my own son." Loki looked up in surprise and asked, "Really?" with hope in his eyes. I tightened up the hug a little and whispered, "Yes Loki, I do." I felt cold tears dampen my tunic. I sighed and lovingly rubbed his back and said softly, "I will be there for you, always little brother." Loki relaxed in my arms for a few moments before he regained his emotions and let me go. He said to me, "I have a lot to think about. Thank you for being there for me." I smiled and said to him, "Anytime Loki, anytime." Hades' Clochali's, Dormor's point of view. I sighed as I appeared in my room, tired after listening to Loki's story. I had a lot to think of, plus my one-man war on the Kree Empire. I closed my eyes feeling my age of several thousand years. I felt old and tired, yet I looked no older than 20, maybe 21 years old. I sighed as I slowly drifted off into a dreamless sleep. I woke up when the sun has shone in my room, and I yawned and stretched. I got up feeling more refreshed than I have in years. I smiled and muttered, "I have to talk with Mother later and maybe Odin." As I walked towards the throne room, I felt a sense of dread in the pit of my stomach. I growled softly as I summoned my swords and my armor. I slowly stalked towards the courthouse. I gathered shadows to add onto my armor. Icy spikes appeared on the armor. I opened the door, and I saw Thor with a smug expression and Odin in his armor with the army of Asgard behind him. He said to me in a booming voice, "You are under arrest for treason and for war crimes." I growled as I put down my helmet and said darkly, "Treason? What did I do for that, oh mighty Odin?" Ice began to form in the throne room, and my eyes turned black as I sensed a battle underway. Odin said, "Someone told you we're building an army, a personal army, which is treasonous." I growled and said, "I work alone, father, you should know that by now. I am the god of death." I roared as I glared at him. My eyes turned to a black hellfire with my rage. Thunder rolled outside when Thor stepped up, his eyes a bluish white as electricity was arcing around his body with Mjolnir twirling. I growled as I glared at him. My fast temper was getting the best of me as I glared at them. I said, "Why not ask Heimdall, the all-seeing seer?" Odin glared at me with his one eye and said, "You know you can hide from his sight for extended amounts of time." I glared back at him but said nothing. Odin glared and said coldly, "Surrender now, and I will show some mercy." I growled as I forced my armor away and my sword. I kept my first sword as I said, "Odin, you know that only you can beat me if you can." I glared at him with rage. I muttered a curse and said, "I will not be here when Asgard has a need. If it falls, it is on your head, Odin. You brought this curse upon yourself." I knew the Dark Elves were still alive, but they were still a few hundred years away. I glared at Thor. I wanted to curse him, but I knew he could yet have a change of heart. I asked, "Where are Loki and Mother?" Odin said coldly, "In a safe place where they would not get in the way of the fight." I snorted and said, "You mean slaughter. I do not want to kill anyone, not right now." I turned my back and said, "I am out of here. Boom asterisk." I groaned as I stood up in pain. I turned around to see a paled Thor. I growled and asked, "Was that your best shot, coward? To attack a man with his back is turned? I demand a duel of honor." Odin paled before he smirked and said, "You are a traitor. You have no such right." I smirked and said, "Ah, I was only accused. But what evidence do you have that I am besides Thor's word? An envious brother?" I stood up as I pulled the darkness and the cold into me. I stood up taller than before. I stood 12 foot tall. I towered over them. As I said, "Pray tell me, what do you want, Odin? What is my punishment? What would Freya say?" Odin growled and glared at me as he said darkly, "You are too dangerous." Without warning, he blasted me with his trusted spear, Gingnir. It struck me in the chest, sending me flying across the room. My shirt burned off, but my thin chainmail vibranium suit survived unscathed. I grunted as I stood up. Anger and rage filled me to the core. I tried to bite it down, but it was wanting to roar and lash out. As I was debating with myself, I felt a portal open up as Odin muttered a cruise and enchantment. I could feel his life force tied to it. I knew I was up a creek without a paddle as it sucked me in. Line break, time skip. 1000 years, third-person point of view. Even after all this time, Loki and Freya still have not forgiven Odin for what he did. Thor was next in line due to being second-born, and Odin's favorite child. Loki caused much more chaos and mischievous, though he still could see Hades in his dreams, where they communicated and trained even though Odin locked his body up. Loki kept him up to date with the happening of Asgard and the Nine Realms, and on Earth. Tonight was the night of Thor's crowning. Thor wanted everything to be perfect, but of course, such things were impossible. As the crowning happened, frost giants, renegades went down to the vault where the casket of ancient eternal winter was stored. Odin stared out at his kingdom. 2 ravens, Hugin and Munin, flew up to the balcony, landed his side. Odin's side turned away from the window. He was feeling his age. Guilt filled him as he realized the mistake he made 1,000 years to the day, but there was not doing anything to undo the curse. Deep down, he knew that Thor was still a mere child and he was much too brash like he was when he was in his youth. It was his own son that taught him the value of wisdom. Thor had Loki, but there has been a barrier between them, but it was not as bad as it was for the first century. The first 50 years Loki did not say a word to Thor and gave him the cold shoulder. But now they are much, much better, though they are not as close as they once were or what could have been. Odin sensed something inside his vault. He slammed down his scepter on the floor that caused the destroyer armor came out and destroyed the few frost giants that somehow managed to enter the vault. Thor was beyond angry that his crowning ceremony was interrupted by some lowly frost giants. Little did he know that Loki was one himself. Thor marched with the warrior 3 by his side to Odin. "Father, we need to teach Jotunheim a lesson." Odin sighed. His wrinkled hand pinched the bridge of his nose as he sighed. He knew Thor was quick to anger, short on patience and very arrogant since his eldest sibling has left. Odin remembered a saying that his firstborn son taught him, "An eye for an eye, we would all go blind." Sometimes it is better to be a bigger man and let an insult slide lest a war start. Odin knew now that Clothelai was right, but it was far too late for that. Odin said with a heavy sigh, "Thor, my son, the Jotun has paid with their lives. Is this truly worth a war where our people will die?" Thor growled and said, "You are an old fool. The 9 realms used to respect Asgard." Odin sighed, knowing since he banished Hades away, he had alienated much of the 9 realms because Hades had been a large role in their lives, from protecting to learning from them and teaching them. Odin was blind. Even to this day the dwarves were not so friendly to Asgard except to Loki and Freya and Frigga. The 9 realms loved Hades, well for the most part, but all respected him. Odin glared at his second-born son and said coldly, "Leave me, I will not start a war." Thor growled but turned and left Odin. Hades's, Clothelai's, Dor Mor's, point of view. Time skip. 1001 years, I growled as I floated in the void. I could feel my rage wanting to kill Odin for everything that he did to me, but I held back. I knew he was one of the few that could rival if not defeat Thanos. So I refrained from attacking the bond between my prison and his life force. As I was about to dispel another volley of darkness and ice to help keep my sanity, otherwise my rage could overtake me. I do not care if I could astral project myself to Earth, which I did do, and I learned under the Ancient One. There was a significant difference between Earth's magic, Asgard's magic, and the magic of other worlds. I sensed a tug in my heart. I paused and followed the lead until everything blurred and I blacked out. When I came to my senses, I groaned and looked around, and I saw Freya and Loki. I glared at them and growled. Mother shushed me and Saeed, "Shush you. Odin is in Odin's sleep." That weakened the curse enough for you to come out. I smiled a little and asked them, "What took him so long?" Loki snorted and said to me, "He is a stubborn Viking king." I chuckled and smiled as I said to Freya, "Mother, where were you and Loki when I was sent to the void?" The mood changed and went somber as she said to me, "Son, Loki and I were in the prison cell. Odin did not want us getting caught in the crossfire. She sighed and kissed my temple and said to me, "You could have escaped, why didn't you?" It was my turn to sigh as I said softly, "I could have slaughtered them all, why did I not? They were my friends when I was a mere boy. And I could not hurt them." Odin lied to me when he said he would show me mercy. I clenched my fist. I knew I could quickly and easily kill Odin now, but did not want that, he was still my father. Loki hugged me and said, "I would have fought with you, brother, till we were in Valhalla." I playfully ruffled his hair and said softly, "No need for that, Loki, though it means a lot to me." Loki scowled, not liking his hair messed up. I growled as I asked, "And where is the other Odinson?" Freya sighed and said, "Your brother." I cut her off and said with a snarl, "Thor is no brother to me." She winced and then said, "Thor is still mortal, on Midgard." I closed my eyes and exhaled out of my nose and clenched my fists as I said coldly, "Has he learned his lesson yet?" Freya sighed and said, "It has been a year, and he has not learnt too much." She shook her head sadly and said, "He is still prideful, arrogant, and selfish." I sighed and said, "You know, I could visit him. With me being out, he would think Odin had died." Loki grinned and said, "And Freya can claim to banish him to Earth until he has changed." I smirked and said, "Exactly." Freya sighed and said to us, "I do not know about the plan. It could very well backfire in our faces." Her voice trailed off. I gave her a grim nod and said, "It could, but it could also work. It could be what we need to get Thor back, though I think Loki should come with me. He has a silver tongue. He is known for the god of lies for reasons." Loki gave me a mischievous smirk but said nothing. I sighed softly and then said, "Okay, we have to stay low-key." Loki smirked at me. I sighed and then said, "Discreet, undercover, underhanded. We do not interfere with more than we have to." Loki gave me a look that was far too innocent. I knew he would cause some chaos, but I knew that was in his nature, sort of like me, and causing death and cold. I smiled fondly and shook my head as I said to him, "This could be dangerous." Loki snorted before breaking down in laughter as he said, tearing up, "Ha ha ha ha, Midgard dangerous to an Asgardian, ha 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 ha." I grunted and said coolly, "You forget that I lived on Midgard for thousands of years and have had a few children. Two of the better known are Alexander the Great. The second being Genghis Khan. I am not so proud of that one, but he is one of my own children. Both were conquerors of their own eras and are renowned for the making of their empire." I sighed and said, "Besides, times have changed, it is more chaotic. I think there is one being that could beat you and rival Thor in brute strength." Loki wiped the tears out of his eyes and asked me, "And who would this being be?" I smirked and then said to him, "The Incredible Hulk." Loki chuckled and shook his head bemused, thinking a Midgardian could pose a threat to him, let alone Thor. He said to me, "Really? That is the name?" I said, amused, and closed my eyes as I made a black hologram out of shadows to make it look like the Hulk. "This is the Hulk, but instead of being black, he is green and mean." Loki's grin was wiped off of his face when he saw the Hulk's shadow form. I smirked amused and then said calmly, "I see, you see what I mean now. Hades' Clochali's, Dormor's point of view." I chuckled softly at the paling Loki's face. I smiled and said, "Just try not to piss him off, and you will be okay." I smiled at Freya and said, "I will try. The key word there is try to keep this one out of trouble, no promises there." Freya sighed and wished the two of us luck before she kissed me on the forehead and saying, "You just got back, I wished you would stay." I sighed and gave her a tight hug and said softly, "I am sorry, mother, but I am a restless soul. Death is not bound in one place, neither am I." She sighed and tightened her hold on me for a second before she let me go, but she said to me in a loving, kind tone, "Try not to kill anyone important down there, please." I sighed and said, "I will try not to kill anyone, but my hand might be forced." Loki sighed and then said to me, "Death follows you wherever you go." I groaned and said with a light growl, "Not everywhere, kid." Loki arched an eyebrow but said nothing. I sighed and said, "Let's get to Midgard. I hope Thor is back to his usual self before long." Part of me still wanted to kill both Thor and Odin for doing what they did to me. I growled with anger, the darkness swirling with my rage as it began to freeze the ground around me. I felt someone place a warm hand on my shoulder and a soft motherly voice, "Son, please calm down, please." I slowly calmed down and began to control my emotions. I sighed as I turned to her. I said softly, I am sorry Mom. Sometimes my feelings get the better of me. You have no idea how I feel, the rush of freedom, the strong desire for vengeance and the desire to kill. I sighed and then added, I have been locked away for 1,000 years. Well, my body was at least. No one can shackle my mind. She wrapped me up in her arms and gently rocked me against her bosom. She kissed my temple as I felt the tears of injustice, of rage, of betrayal fall as I began to sob, her holding me. Loki placed a hand on my other shoulder and then said, I am here for you, brother. You have always been more of a father to me. I sighed and thought to myself, if you only knew the truth, Loki. I shook my head and then said to him, thank you, Loki, but time is of the essence. I clenched my fists as I said, darkness is on the horizon. I can see death of at least half of all things we know. I have witnessed Ragnarok. I sighed but did not elaborate. Loki opened his mouth and began to ask me, when? I gave a humorless chuckle and said, I do not know how, but it happened after Mother and Odin died. So I suggest keeping Odin alive for a while longer. Freya sighed but said nothing, knowing the future is not always as it seems. She could see not everything was what it appeared to be. I sighed and said to Loki, come, brother, we have a lot of work to do. A few hours later, I stayed outside the tent while Loki went inside the shield tent.